Hey everybody, Edo here, and I am excited. I have Keith Mateka on the line. Say hello, Keith.
Hey, hey.
And like 3 or 4 years ago, pretty long time ago, we were running towards the Skulk Hollow Kickstarter, I believe, and we filmed a video about asymmetric design, like thoughts and perspective or something like that. And we talked about the process and a lot of our experience working on and building Skulk Hollow, which, if you're not familiar with it, is a game where one player plays as this gigantic guardian who has a guardian board and abilities, and the other player is this group of Foxen characters who have lots of units and their own sort of cards, and they can work around. And in the game, you can either play this set of lots of units or one of these big guardians, and it comes with four, and we've since released and done all that. Over the many years since, we've been working on Maul Peak. And Maul Peak is actually heading to Kickstarter very soon. It's going to be launching on April 5th. And thought it was a good opportunity to talk about this again but rather than just talk about asymmetric design, we thought it would be cool to talk about sort of expansion or building on top of like what's it like to build a sequel or expansion to an existing design that's an asymmetric design, right? And what are some of the unique challenges that comes up, which we had to face as we've gone through this process. And so that's what I think would be fun. So let's go ahead and do it. And for those who don't know, Keith Mateka runs Thunderworks Games, role player, cartographers, all sorts of fantastic games over there. Skulk Hollow is a collaboration he's been doing with Pencil First, but all around great creator, game maker, designer, awesome dude. Okay, so what were you about to say?
Yeah, I was just thinking about jumping in and talking about Skulk Hollow was doing well on Kickstarter, and we said, how do we want to do more, right? So this is a great game. We need to expand this world. It's going to be awesome. The world is full of board game expansions. So, what are the next steps for us? And we had a lot of conversations about it. And, I was looking at the asymmetric game that at least at the time that I would always think of is Neuroshima Hex. And they had, their base game, and then they were selling these little armies that you could kind of add in. And the thing that was interesting about it is that obviously it's a super asymmetrical game, and each of their little armies had something unique about them, made them special, their own version of asymmetry. And that was like one path that we were talking about for a long time. I don't know if
yeah, no, so this was this is like the production side, but I think this was super interesting to me, which is at the time, I mean, there are lots of different games in the marketplace that have expanding content. You mentioned Hiroshima Hex. There's also certainly not necessarily asymmetric, but you could look at things like Dice Throne, which were adding new characters to it and to the lineup, and a variety of games. So we got into this conversation to start with, which was like, well, okay, what are our options? So one option was like, hey, well, let's just release ongoing content, right? Let's release a new Guardian, or let's release a new faction on the the hero side. Yeah. And one of the interesting and should it be should we do it quarterly? Should it be lots of little expansions? Is it a product? Is it a series of products that leads into a Kickstarter release? Do you do a Kickstarter for each little thing? There's a lot of machinations that come around with the idea of, hey, especially if you're a Kickstarter-driven business, how do you sort of package and think about, there's what's interesting and fun to play. We had Guardians that we didn't release, right? That were either didn't make the chopping block or needed more time, or, there only so many fit in the box. So there was things you could imagine trying to move quickly. But then what does that release look like? Well, okay, so are we going to sell $10 Guardian packs that don't fit in the box? It was also interesting in this game, there was a real box size issue, which might, in some of these other games where you have a new faction or a new deck or a new this, you can imagine just having a deck of cards or whatever. But Skulk Hollow is a lot about sort of going, going really big with 2-player asymmetric, which was sort of a cornerstone of the game. So if we're like, hey, we're going to release a Guardian, it's like, okay, so wait a minute, is this like a Guardian has a Guardian board that's almost a 10 by 10. It's got a meeple, and then it has a deck of cards and whatever else the Guardian has. So it's like this really awkward thing to like standalone sell, and then suddenly you're like putting it in a box that's like the size of a full size game box,
right?
That maybe is thin. But then you're like, what am I going to? Am I going to charge $10? Like, so it became difficult to. Not difficult, but part of figuring that out was like, how could you get it manufactured? What's the audience? What's the interest? How do you draw it? I think another part that was important was we felt strongly that we always knew we wanted to do more hero factions, and we felt strongly that they really should be different. And and as part of the sort of narrative world, like early on, and you can see this in Skulk Hollow and a little narrative elements, this idea of like different cultures and different regions of the world, and like what they might be like, and what is it in a winter environment. I mean, I think to some way, with taking Shadow of the Colossus and early inspirations to this game aside, it's like very video gamey. So like, what's the ice world like? What's the fire world like? What's the death world?
The jungle
like?
World or whatever.
The jungle,
yeah.
right?
That's totally a video game thing,
right?
And that was like an early direction, right? We're like, okay, what is the environment for the next game or for the next thing? I mean, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but like that was an early conversation, and like, the idea of doing snow was, we all kind of decided like, it's kind of the most different from what we've already done. And it has like, there's all kinds of, I don't know, maybe Frozen was popular at the time. I don't know. Like,
I mean, I think it's just a standard game biome, right? And so part of it then started, we were leaning into the conversation about like, how could you do a new region and a new culture and a new environment justice? Could it be done piecemeal? There's so much upfront cost in terms of like the art, the direction, figuring it all out. That, it found myself leaning towards I think the only way to do this is to go big. And I think ultimately, and like some of this ties into like how much flexibility Pencil First Games has, like, there's a difference between like a Roxley and an Us or Wizards of the Coast and Us in terms of the ability to like consistently know that we can deliver regular content because everyone's employees, and like, Dustin Faust, amazing artist, is not somebody who I have infinite access to at all times, right? So there's a certain amount of like logistics to making something where it's like, well, you might as well, if you have to go through all these logistical pieces, make the thing. And which then led to the biggest component, which has been a huge part of why this has taken so long to bring to market, is like, okay, well, we're gonna do this new environment. We're gonna do standalone. What does that mean? It's a new environment. It's a new board. It's a new hero group. It's a new set of guardians. Presumably, it's
and like being standalone was like pretty important to me. I mean, obviously, as a publisher, you're making the final decision, but I always love, the problem with traditional expansion is that the target market is the people who have the base game. With something that's a standalone expansion that can be played by itself, like, it's a great entry point for people who are interested in it that never got around to trying Skulk Hollow, or maybe if Skulk Hollow's out of print, but Maul Peak is, people can still grab it and jump in. Like, I think that there's a lot of flexibility for players. If like they can buy either game, and if they love it, they can buy the other one, and they can mix and match them, which is what you're about to talk about, right?
Yeah, right. Well, and then it's like, well, if you're going to do that, you like, of course, you have to be able to mix and match them. Like, of course, you need to be able to take the new Guardians and play them versus the old Foxen or the Grizzer, which are the bears, versus the the original Guardians, and And so like yeah like and so that became a fun like at some point, which was not recently. I mean, this is probably 3 years ago. We said we are going to make it's going to be a standalone game that is going to be the price point, weight, level of execution of Skulk Hollow. Like you're just going to like, and which hopefully as you look at the Kickstarter and our prototyping and what we've been like, I believe I can now say on the other side of this, like we've delivered. You pick this up and you're like, you have like as awesome a reaction to like Skulk Hollow as you open this thing up. You're like, oh my goodness, it's like it's got this winter vibe and all these things and these guardians and blah, blah, you know. I feel like we've repeated that. But we also, you know, as part of that said it's going to be all those things, and it's going to be cross compatible with the original.
Right.
And also at that point, two other conversations, which maybe we can touch on later on in this chat or not, that we dealt with was what if is there any solo, because that kept coming up in the original, and then the other thing that came up all the time was like, you know, can it be for more than 2 players or 3 or 4 players or stuff like that? Like, could that exist? And so like those are active conversations that are happening all through this process. Right. And so, which we'll probably get to, but with the like marching orders, for lack of a term, the like what we decided to do was, hey, we're going to do the standalone, you know, game. So then it came, okay, cool. What's in it? What are we going to do? And right. So I think very early on we had a sheet, which we still use now, which was just like, what are a bunch of amazing, cool hero groups, you know, cultures, classes, types, like animals. What are a ton of like cool guardian ideas, both in terms of creatures, both in terms of ability sets, like, and then we had this like, what are cool environments, places that we want to explore in this world, and you know, how does that all work in? And
so like as we were developing the first game, you know, ideas that didn't make it in made it over to the sheet. As we're working on it, we come up with cool ideas that like aren't part of the scope of what we're currently working on, go onto the sheet. And that just becomes like the first, you know, the starting point of like, all right, well, let's kick this off. These are the ideas we currently have. And then let's maybe start there, or maybe we'll come up with some new things along the way. You know, it's just kind of a brainstorming document. And it's proven to be, you know, a nice kind of, you know, I guess kickstart to the process.
Yeah, and feedback from players and things we learned, and I think getting mechanically that I think was a lot of interesting decisions we end up making, you know, as we were building it out. I do think it was interesting where some of it ends up driving other things. So like I think there's always been a Spider Guardian could be cool. Like I think that was something we knew from the beginning. We may have even tried it on Skulk Hollow at some point or another, or at least thought about it. But so like Veblen, who's the Spider Guardian in Maul Peak, was like pretty like, we're gonna do the Spider Guardian. And actually, I think for a while, we had earmarked the Spider Guardian as part of sort of a death blighty, swampy type biome, as opposed to the winter biome. But we had decided winter, and we were like, but we still want to do the spider's the right one to do. So we ended up with this like crystalline, super awesome winter spider. But like that was like a weird mix. And then you have other things, which is like Saboso, who's the like abomination snowman monster, which was very like, well, you're doing a snow biome. You're doing, you know, how can you not have, you know, your equivalent of like marshmallow or like whatever giant creature in that. It's just like
the
inherent.
Stay Puft Marshmallow Man of the frozen tundra.
of snowman, and so like there's some interesting. I think heading into now the design process, there were some like interesting thematic or just like cool factor or cross section of previous ideas we had starting points, but then we were faced with and I think. Keith, maybe you can talk about this a little bit. This point of like, okay, is the chicken or the egg? We have this. We have Guardians, and we have the idea of the hero faction, the Bears, and what you going to design first, right? Like, what do you like? And the other thing that was really important, sorry to interrupt, was with the whatever direction we went with the hero faction, felt very strongly it had to feel very different.
Right.
What are ways, and we spent a lot of time talking about like core player, like deck hand unit summoning a perspective would make it feel really fresh and distinctive from the foxes, and like also their stats, and just like what are the different ways to really make it feel different. So that was another like sort of cornerstone of the design, I think.
Yeah, for sure. So I mean, there was this like, okay, let's I need to start kind of blocking in these different, also the hero faction and the guardians, but we're building on a base, right? So we're building on top of Skulk Hollow. If we're gonna change something about the game for Maul Peak, it can't break the ability of like the cross compatibility piece. So like figuring out where there's opportunities to change things, where things have to stay the same. We can't, we can't turn it into some, we can't do such a dramatic change for the sequel in which the first game becomes incompatible.
And actually, some offset of that were some extremely hard locks in a few places. For example, it became a hard lock on the board size and tile layout, right? Like we sort of early on were like, well, if we want the Foxing cards to work at all, they're just like the idea, the core of leaping onto some of that core base just was like, we're not going to mess with that because it would just fall apart.
Right.
But keep going.
Yeah. So then I decided to start with the Guardians, and basically the goal was to find 4 unique Guardians that all have different abilities. They all feel different, but they also feel different from the ones that are in Skulk Hollow. So each one needs to have kind of its own unique mechanic, kind of the hook for the Guardian. So so having, in my mind, there's this rule that like every Guardian needs a unique win condition, and then like most of their abilities need to be unique to them. Maybe they can have a special token of some kind or some kind of special piece, but there's a limit there. You can't go crazy on one. And so then we got started. The Veblen was probably the first one out of the gate, which is the spider one, and his I don't know, that character's win condition is to like try to, spiders, you think of webs, so now the spiders got web tokens they're spitting out. And then I always think of those scenes from like Lord of the Rings where Frodo's all wrapped up by Shelob or whatever. So this idea of like
there's a lot of Shelob in this spider for sure.
I mean, guilty as charged. I love myself some Lord of the Rings, but so what is the equivalent of that in this game? You think through. So their win condition is like they the spider Veblen is trying to get them in their lair space, and you put a lot of webs in that area so that it's difficult for them to escape. So Veblen is interesting because you're trying to push the hero factions in a specific spot, but they can walk out of there if they want. Like it's not easy, but they can walk out of there. So it's like they're almost like herding cats a little bit, like the spider. So that was a fun one. And one of the kind of innovations, I guess, on Veblen was like usually on the Guardian board, which represents the Guardian's body, there's all these connected areas to attack. Veblen is split, in which you can go up one side, but you can't get to the other side. To get there, you have to like jump off and go up on the other side, or you can have 2 teams kind of climbing the spider at the same time. And the other thing, Veblen is really interesting. And the other thing that's interesting is Veblen starts out with a large hand size, but as you like knock out her legs, her hand size starts getting smaller and smaller. So there's a lot of interesting play that comes out of that. That makes Veblen really interesting.
Yeah, and I think this is all obviously unique to the world of Boar and Skulk Hollow and Maul Peak and this series of games. But, as part of the design, getting back to like sort of thinking through this, we were really looking at all of the different characteristics that make these Guardians interesting. So for us in this world, that's not only it's your hand, it's your action and movement, it's your abilities, which you mentioned, but also on the Guardian side, it's how your Guardian track moves, where your hit points are. I think an interesting decision we made that we've maintained through Maul Peak, though may break in the future, was all of them have the same total number of hit points. So we ended up putting the distribution of those hit points around. So some have it plays different dynamics, but they're not bound to everyone, whatever it's 13 or however many it is. Yeah. It's consistent. Which was and it was something we could have broken. I mean, I don't think that would have necessarily broken Skulk Hollow in any way. Like, I don't think there was but it was sort of a baseline consistency, a scalability that we're looking at. But that was a part of it. And then you also just, not only do we have the tracks, but how heroes can leap between tracks, and whether there were other restrictions in there, which we ended up adding. Right. So go ahead.
I mean, basically, the piece that I wanted to talk about was like that. We started working on these Guardians, and we're playtesting them against the foxes. Like, yes. The bears don't exist yet, right? So, but we have this static thing that isn't going to change. So that it kind of it was a great kind of playtesting bed as a starting point for all.
Yeah, it was like a good jump off point. Now, do we? I can't remember because it was a long time ago. I can't remember. Did we get through all Guardians and then move to Bear? So we actually got through all of them.
Yeah, all of them. Yeah. So I mean, like the process of like Veblen got the web thing. We had this idea. The kind of this one of the characters is like is a Quagga, I believe, in which like there's you're putting confusion cards into your opponent's deck, which was like a brand new mechanic for Skulk Hollow. It didn't mess with any of the things we wanted to main constant, but it definitely has a much different play style in which like the idea is that there's this big ice dragon with multiple heads, and it kind of has some mind control abilities, and it can like get the heroes to attack each other, and you're like throwing confusion cards.
Well, let's back up a second there, sir. Let's just back up. What I would just say is, that guy Quagga, who prior to being a four-headed dragon was just a cloud of nature, confusion, and magic.
That's not true.
A big part of that was this idea of like, it really comes down to, and which is why I'm so excited about Maul Peak and what playing it and everything about it, is really not just like, how do we put another it wasn't like, how do we put another thing to kill, right? It wasn't like, how do we throw another piece of content out there that you can play? It really was and is, how can we create different dynamics of play that feel different and force the player to play differently? So one of the really interesting things that people will experience after they play Maul Peak and we're going to move to talking about the Grizzer in a second, but when you take these Guardians back to the original, in some ways, they were built to like make, and this is true on the Bears, and which is why the Bears then also feel different playing the original Guardians, but they were meant to force the player to play differently. So Quagga was about like, well, what if I'm not necessarily moving around the board a lot? I'm more like just sort of thwarting you and confusing you and like having you attack, like your units attack themselves. More of that mastermind. It's more of the Cthulhu-esque, right? Like madness approach than, or like just a magic black deck. But that kind of thing. Whereas, as you were saying with Veblen, one of the things you didn't mention, which is huge, is Mystify, which is an ability that steals a power cube or rage, in the case of the Bears, away from the player. So suddenly, a dynamic which is never true with the Foxen in the original game is like, you need to think about whether or not you're going to put a power cube out there because you have this guardian that will steal it from you. And like for which is just like an emotion, a type of decision moment, a dynamic that doesn't exist in like maybe you decide whether you want to use a card for power cubes or for an attack, but you're never like, no, I shouldn't put a power cube out onto the field.
Right. It's like he played the card that had Mystify on it last turn, so I know he doesn't have it right now. So I'm going to play some cubes, or versus like he just shuffles his deck. I might not want to play all these power cube cards because he's going to steal one, and that's going to give him an extra action next turn. Like that's a big deal.
Yeah, and so a lot of it was about how can all these sum up into not just another thing to fight, but really a very new dynamic of play and fun and tension. And again, I think for Skulk Hollow, sort of narrative and thematic moments, with the dual action cards and deck drawing and everything about Skulk. This isn't like measured out, deep, like hard tactical. Like there's a lot of swing and flow and movement that happens in Skulk Hollow, and Maul Peak, and a lot of that produces like these incredible storytelling moments and
I was gonna say like cinematic moments, right, where you like. They're memorable, and those I love games where like after you play it, and then you can kind of tell the story of the game to somebody else who wasn't even there, and it's just it's entertaining. So.
Yeah, and so capturing that, I think I do want to move to the Grizzer, but I think for the sake of capturing it, so the Veblen, Spider, webs, locking players down. Lots of movement. A lot of these a lot of things that we also brought into the Guardian play in the Seagulls. There's a little bit more action, mobility, player choices. The Skulk Hollow Guardians. A number of them had a little bit more, less but more powerful things that they were doing. So
they were like more lumbering giants.
Yeah.
There's some guys. Some of these guardians can really move around if they want to in this.
Yeah. And part of that was just also expanding on a meteor balance in terms of play choice and range between Guardian and player, right, as you're playing, which I think is building on the base. Saboso, his big thing is he's lumbering, he's the Grack, right? But his big thing was he can freeze, and basically his win condition is he takes units off the board and he permanently kills them or stores them
like in an ice prison in his body. So he's like picking up foxes or bears and just like putting them in ice prison basically.
Yeah. And there's a certain inevitability and a flow to that, which actually turned out to be more even though he started with the Foxens, it's more dynamic with the Bears because we haven't talked about them, but they're limited in that you only get one of each, and once they're gone, they're gone. So like the Foxen, you don't have not reproduction, but the rapid release of Foxen like you do with the Bears. So Quagras, we talked about really manipulating the other player's deck, moving them around. He has some really interesting dynamics where you can't get to certain parts of him until you take out the center. So like there's like it's not a POTA, but it's got an interesting vibe to it. And then the last, which is sort of bonkers, is Trovek and Gnarl.
Right. So the question was like, what if the Guardian had two meeples on the board? What if there was a team of Guardians that were coming after the heroes? And this is the answer. So Trovek and Gnarl. Gnarl is like this three-headed Cerberus, dog character, and Trovek is basically like his master. And the idea behind it was like, the Gnarl will run out and do like these massive attacks, and then Trovek is kind of calling him back all the time. And there's a bunch of benefit to like moving the two characters into the same space. So like the mechanic, it revolves around trying to keep them together, and then Gnarl kind of feels like he's like kind of going crazy and running away from his master and doing lots of damage to the unfortunate.
And playtest. These are all like, as we're going through and iterating and playtesting and iterating. There's like all different phases of this process, right? So this is a lot of the early phases where Keith comes up with a version, and I think this is so long. This part is actually pre-COVID. That's the crazy part. This is how long this has been. I remember we actually did this in person together instead of on
Right,
tabletop.
we played tested, I think, all four of them in person before COVID.
Yeah. Oh, it's crazy. I forget that world. And we continue to play test, obviously, but that's all a lot. We have a digital version that we use with folks when we're testing and we're playing. Because for those who don't know, we don't live in the same state remotely.
I think that might have been the last time I saw you in person.
Yeah, was it? Yeah, probably.
I've
I mean,
seen
it was the topic du jour. It's been the topic du jour for 3 years. But anyway, the interesting thing with that would be like you would just have this one, and this unit feels like they don't feel related to each other, or like why would I just keep taking the dog and I just kill it, like. Hey Keith, I think there's a problem here if I'd never need to do anything but just attack with this dog, right? Like it's just killing everybody. And it was just a very fun process, and ended up with a lot of, when you have such a interesting set of conditionals you're playing against, a lot of interesting mechanics come out. And so like how can we incentivize them to come together? Well, maybe when they come together, you can generate a power. Okay, so like they're coming together and then they're getting a little boost for the next round, and then you start thinking about that win condition, and it's like you want the win condition to sort of feel like it's happening through play. Like you don't want it to be too off to the side. So that's how it came out of them generating and using power as part of how they can win as well. So there's some really interesting emergent choices in play and design, I guess, emergent design that comes out between play testing and iterating on these Guardians.
Yeah.
Okay, so we go through this process, and actually, and I'm trying. I think there was a bear version as well while we were still. It's been a long time.
So then we start working on the Grizzar, right? So
yeah.
What are the design tenets? Like what we're obviously comparing it to the Foxens the whole time, and there's some big changes we're talking about. Like one, Foxes have all their units in the same deck, and they can be summoned multiple times. Now with the Grizzar, we've got the den board that has the characters that we have, and there's one copy of each one. So like, and once that they get exhausted or killed or whatever, they go to the graveyard. So like this idea, like that these characters are expendable. Like they're not expendable, right? Their death is permanent, in other words. So that makes the game feel a lot different. And the fact that they are summoned outside of your deck, you're never like hoping to draw that one character
right.
that you really want to summon. They're available all the time.
And that's such a core. It's an interesting, very core difference from Skulk Hollow. Like a real deep part of that is that draw deck management is such a core, sort of deeper play of that game. Splitting it created a lot of interesting dynamics with the Grizzar. But keep going. Yeah.
So then, and then because we have fewer units and you can only summon them once, and bears are kind of beefy in general. Like
they're certainly bigger than foxes. They're certainly bigger than foxes.
if I'm a fox, I don't want to go up against a bear. I'm just saying. But so we gave them a lot more hit points, right? So in the foxes, there's a lot of units that only have like one, that can only take one damage, and with the bears, there's characters that can take at least 4 damage. So they're definitely more, they're beefier. Each one is beefier, and their abilities are interesting as well. So so we have these characters that are outside of the deck, and you can bring them onto the board. But there's a new currency for the bears, which I mentioned earlier, called Rage. And so you can spend Rage to bring out your characters. And we went through a bunch of iterations of how you can get Rage, and there's ways that you can get it through the deck and a couple other ones. But so Rage is the new currency just for the bears. You use them to summon them, and then there's also some abilities.
Well, so there was an interesting point here where two interesting conversations came together, I think. One is, so once you bring in this, we have Rage. What does Rage do? How does it work? Is it just mana for summoning? Is it part of it? But these abilities on these creatures are much more powerful. How do we trigger them? Especially when a lot of the the abilities, or a number of the abilities on the bears are like
They're kind of
not. Go
they're
ahead.
kind of passive, right? They're like, if you do this thing, then you get to do this thing for free. There's like at least two characters that are like that. So
But there are
yeah,
some that have a cost, which is so. But then you do have one sort of like the leaders in Skulk Hollow that have like they you spend a power cube with a leader to do their ability. So like the mage has an ability which is like a fireball, or the herbalist has the ability to like generate rage, and should those cost rage or should they cost something else? And so through that we ended up sort of we moved away from the melee, or excuse me, the ranged missile, the missile attack ability from Skull Hollow, and have this magic ability, which is, I mean, it's like an icon on the card that like gives you use magic, and that it's like it has an interesting spend synergy with rage, where it's not just rage everywhere, because unlike Skull, I guess what I'm saying is in Skull Hollow you don't use power cubes to get units, you only use power cubes to get that free ability, whereas in Maul Peak, it doesn't function that way, and just working through that was a big deal.
right. And so I mean, we didn't mention this, but like one of the big focuses on this game was to create a wider variety of experiences for the hero player, right? So in Skull Hollow, you've got your four different leaders you can choose, but besides that, you know, the Foxen deck is the Foxen deck. So in this one, now we have our heroes, our Grizzar, but we also have these winter beasts. So these are, I believe is there six of them?
Yes, there's six.
Yeah. So there's I should know this.
No,
There's
it's, I
six.
mean, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if there were six or eight, but there's six of them, and they're these winter beasts, these small animals, and one starts on the board, and you get to choose one at the beginning of the game, just similar to how you were choosing your leader. But now each of them has their own special ability. They all play very different, and many of them have um, abilities that use rage as kind of to fuel them to pay for their abilities. So you're using rage to summon your bears onto the board, and you're also using your rage to kind of fuel the abilities of your winter beast.
Right, and there's, and this was an interesting. I think. Okay, so in terms of mechanically, as you were saying, that's how you use rage. There's also the druid, and the druid can sort of, if the winter beast dies, bring the winter beast back, and then the sage has a passive ability that makes using the winter beast's ability a little cheaper.
Right.
I think that, but what was interesting here was sort of like where it was going back to that decision tree that the Foxen made with the leaders, and saying, okay, like, hey, we have the Grizzer, we have these abilities and these bears, but like, where can there be a little setup? You know, like, do we want to just make a bunch of different bears that you pick at the beginning, or how are we, And so so like, I think if you break it down a little bit, it's sort of like taking the uniqueness of the abilities off of a specific leader character and thinking about them more as like a range of sort of, I don't know, I don't want to call it like
Accessory.
it's sort of like an accessory. I don't know what I want to call it, but like, the beast you play, like the abilities, like just to go through on the beasts, are like, one is like spend rage to push the guardian a spot, one is spend rage to draw cards, another's spend rage to force your guardian to discard a card. There's one that like sort of has like a band ability that will sort of teleport, take a bear with them to, it's like the wolf. A wolf will carry the bear to another location with it.
Don't forget about the owl.
Owl can fly and do damage, but they all, not only are they significant in terms of how they change how you play with the bears, because again, with the bears, unlike the Foxen, you have everybody, there's no decision around, either you drew the guy or not, and you're deciding from what you have in your hand. Whereas with the bears, you have this period early on where they're really expensive to summon. So you don't have all bears all the time. You sort of are like, am I going to go the assassin route? Am I going to go the mage route? Am I going to go, the herbalist slash barbarian route? And so basically, you have a much more interesting set of like which bears am I going to use, and then which sort of winter beast am I going to bring into play with them to like use a strategy for which guardian. And like it's a very interesting decision tree, I think, for the player in a way that is much more accessible than maybe I just described it.
I think it is, yeah. But I mean, the thing I like about both Skulk Hollow and Maul Peak is like, all right, I'm the hero player. I'm going up against this guardian. Like, what configuration do I want to try against them? You know, like which one of these beasts do I think is going to be most effective against them, and which, you know, going in, bringing out my assassin early, you know, is a little dangerous because, you know, that's the other thing is the bears. I'm jumping around a little bit, but the bears, because the bears are slow. I mean, slower than a fox, I would say. They're going second no matter what. So that seems like a small change.
Oh man,
the feeling of the game is a lot different when, like, you know, when you're reacting out of your first move instead of acting like you do with the foxes. And then there's, I don't know where I was going with this, but that was a small change that like makes a big impact on just like making sure these two games feel similar, in which they're in the same world and they're cross compatible, but like, you know, they play in the moment to moment gameplay. They play very, very different, which is, I think, one of the coolest things about it.
Yeah, I mean that was like a core objective. I think and all those things came together well. Just to sort of pull back into the design side. So we have the bears. I think moving through when we were playtesting, we did do playtesting with. At this point, we had the Guardians, so we could playtest versus the Guardians, and we had the new ones, and we had the old ones. So we could playtest versus the old ones. And we ended up having to make a few interesting sort of baseline decisions. Like one is like, hey, there are some interesting weird oddities that come out of how this is set up that have to be resolved. Sometimes they're simple, like, hey, how does Veblen's, you know, if it's Mystify versus Rage versus Power, or like how does that work, or some other abilities, how do they work? But right. You know, essentially we're like, look. Job number one, and this is where we then had to do this reconciliation. Job number one for Maul Peak is standalone. When you pick up Maul Peak and you play the Bears versus the Grizzar versus Veblen, or the Grizzar versus Sabos, or whomever, it's got to feel great. It's got to feel like the dynamics and the choices are interesting and working, and that's the priority. And then, you know, when you're like, hey, well, what happens when I mix them? We still want them to feel great. But, you know, it might be like there are a couple places where, like, another example would be when Grak kills a fox, Grak's meter goes up 1, right? For his victory condition meter, where he has to get nine kills. Well, there's not even 9 bears, firstly, right? Like, right. But they're so much harder to kill. So, like, does it make sense, right? So part of it was, hey, make like the core standalone Maul Peak experience shouldn't have any asterisks or special conditions or whatever. But then when we're starting to go across to the other one, we do want that to be really strong as well. But that's where we might do a little, you know. And so we have this battle for boar booklet, which will say like, hey, you know, when Grak is playing the bears, a bear kill is worth 2. Like some of these little one-offs that had to be adjustment to make all the balancing work. Because at this point, like, okay, so at this point we're not at the crazy matrixing testing we then had to embark on for years. At this point we're at, okay, how does this new bear faction feel versus all these other guardians, and where are they working and where aren't they working?
Right.
And I don't think, for sure, we ended up having to make adjustments. For sure. I feel like, and any adjustment you make over here, then you have to go back and test. But I would say largely the core vibe of all the Guardians that you pulled together initially succeeded with the Bears. I'm trying to think of any that, because I think part of it was when we felt, if we felt the bears were underpowered versus these guardians. I mean, this was the advantage of doing the baseline testing you talked about. Right. If it was like, oh, they're getting destroyed. I mean, I think actually, if I recall, bears just got, for a while, they were just getting destroyed. It was because you'd be like, oh, I don't have enough units, or I don't have enough rage, or like whatever. It was like, well, that's the power threshold. Like, this is about how strong these guardians need to be. Like, they can go, we can adjust them, we can tweak them, but we know that these sort of line up to like where the other guardians are in terms of ferocity, whatever term we want to do. So if the bears are sucking wind against all of them, the problem's the bears. Like, let's get the bears stronger. So it was really, I think, about power scaling the bears to where they needed to be, and then looking at like interesting dynamics. I don't remember where, but bear leap mobility became a thing at some point, and we ended up adding, like, we were talking about, like, do we want to have more leap cards in the deck or more double? Like, how do we get them? Because we don't want them just to leap to anywhere. We want the map. And at some point, well, we're like, well, what if they have like I don't know if we ended up naming it or not, but a clamber ability or whatever, which was like good at climbing, which is basically like, once they leap, they can spend a rage to climb one more. Right,
so they get like a free leap action if they spend a rage after they leap once. So that's the foxes in Skulk Hollow. With the rogue who can basically bypass a bunch of these spaces. And they also have their range. All their archers. Yeah. Like, the foxes, can get away with like not having to play a ton of leap cards. Like, they can kind of sidestep that with the right card combinations. The bears are slower, and they have one ranged attacker. She's really expensive to get out. I mean, she's awesome, but like,
I mean, it's one of the best cards of the game. But yeah,
right. But if she dies, then like you're done doing range. So and just the idea of having another place to spend rage, right? So in addition to like summoning, because at the beginning of the game you might be trying to save up your rage to bring characters out, and then near the end of the game, like, maybe your beast is dead, so it's harder to use rage. So then kind of near the end of the game, there's still a value in having rage, in which you get these additional leap actions from the Grizzar. The other just quick thought is that one of the other interesting things about the Grizzar is that they have a lose condition. So just like the foxes, when the leader is killed, then they game over for them. Their king got knocked out. In the Grizzar, doesn't work that way. There isn't like, if you kill this one character, you immediately win from the Guardian side. So now with the Grizzar, basically, if there's no units in play, game over for the Grizzar player. So that has a different feeling, and then you don't have this. Especially when you're playing Fox and Skulk Hollow, you like want to keep certain characters together to protect the leader character. And in Grizzar, you don't have to worry about that as much. Everybody can kind of do their own thing, and there's no kind of shielding of other units.
The whole dynamic around, I think, some interesting shifts where the whole dynamic around protect your king or queen or prince, the leader character, is like very fundamental to all play in Skulk Hollow, right? Like, you have to sort of always be like aware of like incoming damage on that unit and what does that mean, which I think is super interesting. And then removing that really does free up the decision space. I think another thing that is interesting, with the Grizzar is, as they're very strong, right? So there are like some different sort of paths you can go down where you get like a multiplicative effect on benefit. Like, oh, hey, I'm going to get this discount on the Winter Beast abilities, and then I'm going to use the Herbalist, and I'm going to get lots of rage, and I'm going to be able to go. And you can get into these really powerful zones. And I think one of the new dynamics for the Grizzar player, the Guardian versus the Grizzar, is whereas as a Guardian player in Skulk Hollow, I'm like, I have my win condition, and then how am I going to get that king? Like I can never kill every fox, right? They can keep coming. So it's like, how do I? But I think when you're fighting the Grizzer, you still want to destroy things, but a lot of it's like, how do I like what sort of combo advantages is this player driving towards, and how do I thwart that, right? Like, oh, they're leaning heavily on getting building up this. They're like this rage engine with the herbalist ability. I'm just going to kill the herbalist, and I'm not winning, but I'm taking out the like cornerstone of this combo, and then that's going to put them on their back foot. But then it also has a super satisfying dopamine for the Grizzer player, where they do get their combo and they're like, yeah, my assassin just hit you, leaped, and like, I just did 5 damage. You're like, what? What just happened?
Sure.
I killed the wrong bear, right? And I think so. I guess we've been talking for a long time, and obviously you and I enjoy talking about this game.
Right.
So I want to shuttle to a couple things quickly, and then I want to sort of wrap up with a question for you.
Sure.
So we get through this phase of recalibrating everything. We sort of do that, and then we just have this monstrous matrix of playtesting. It's all the combinations of playtesting versus the Guardians on the Maul Peak side. Sort of different tactics you have to play through, different combinations of Winter Beasts you have to play through. This huge matrix. Right. Then we're like, okay, well now we need to play all of the Foxen characters with their matrix of leaders versus all of the Guardians, and then we have to go back and we have to play this, and what we ended up doing, obviously playing on our end, we also we're expanding and getting additional play tests from other folks and feedback from a variety of people, and I don't remember exactly where the step was, but this guy Justin, I think it might have been on the Skulk Hollow side at first, like said, hey, I played it, I'm a random dude you've never heard of, I've played this stuff, here's this like mountain of feedback, and on probably on Skulk Hollow originally, and it was like very thorough, very robust, very well written, very well tested, perspective. And so we started to engage with Justin, got to know him, and then we brought him on to Maul Peak to like start doing all of these, just the like crazy amount of test and support. And again, this is to supplement the playtesting you're doing, that I'm doing, that we're all doing together online, but in different regions. And I think getting all of those plays in and having just the level of rigor that he brought to the table is pretty awesome. I think we'll end up doing another video with him to talk some more about that process, but just getting into that matrix mode, and admittedly, there even still as we're preparing here, we're continuing to do playtests and continuing to refine, continuing to see opportunities to
it's the graphics level 2.
Yeah, we'll tighten up, but like I think one of the interesting things you always have to is recently, what with the prototypes that we've put together, we've been able to do a bunch more new player testing, right? And sometimes, and this was a very like famous Shigeru Miyamoto Nintendo quote, but sometimes you get to a point where like everything gets tuned to expert play, and you like, yeah, this is super competitive when you know how to do the rage leap, how to drop off, when to summon, what beast to use. Like when you have that level of expertise, you have all this agency. But that doesn't mean you're not selling to somebody who plays for the first time without knowing what they're doing, and like that feeling of just like utter crush, and thinking through some of that agency. And so I know we've done some tweaks to Saboso after even some more playtesting, which interestingly enough, you find places where it helps him be more welcoming to new players, but actually more interesting for Saboso players, right? So like there's all sorts of interesting wins, but just this huge mound of playing and refining that's sort of still an ongoing process as we work through it.
It becomes like somewhat House of Cardsy too, right? Like one small change to one thing means a bunch more play testing with all these different kind of, go through the matrix again and see, if that inadvertently created some massive problem or something. So it's an asymmetric game, I think in general probably needs a lot more playtesting and is a lot harder to do. And we have jumped in head first into this, where we have the amount of permutations of play, which is super exciting for a player to all this. I mean, that's the thing I love about opening these boxes. It's like I see the stuff, and it's just like, look at all these amazing toys that that we've created for people to explore. But that it takes a lot of work to get to that point. So definitely testing for this game in particular has been really a large task, and it was great to have Justin come on board, super enthusiastic, coming from a player and then kind of into a development role. And it was great to have him on board, and I don't think we could have finished this game, even though it took us forever to get this game done. I don't know if we would have.
I would definitely say, a certain part of this was getting the artwork together and all. There were other. It wasn't purely the design side, but it's been a lot of iteration and playtesting.
Which is difficult during a pandemic as well, too, right?
So that's been challenging, right? But and then online tools help, and being able to upload in a Tabletopia and make some changes in play, I think is a big deal. Though, I don't want to dive in it. That's not the same as playing a game, right? Like, sometimes, like late, we've had conversations on Tabletopia when it's like, oh, you've got 15 cards in your hand. On Tabletopia, that doesn't seem that weird, maybe because they're all lined up on your computer screen. But like when you're like in your hand, that actually feels a little different, right? Or even like, what was another one? Oh, this will be changed, but like we ended up with more frost tokens for Saboso than we need, and like on Tabletopia or whatever you're playing, you don't really like see them, and it's not as confusing as when you're again on a physical prototype. You're playing more, and you're like, I just feel like I have too many of these things. Like I do this. It for a new player, it's confusing. It's like if I only ever like the max I feel like I'm going to use is 4, and I've got 8 as an example. It starts seeping you with like,
playing this wrong?
Am I playing this wrong? Because I could never. And it's like, no, we should cut it to 6, and it'll be fine. Just make sure to get that number right before you put on the Kickstarter. But anyway, so the thing I want. Okay, so what else did we not talk about? We didn't talk about, and we're not gonna. Is, hey, then we were crazy. We're like, well, what if we could do a 3 to 4 player Smash Brawl where you have the bears and the foxes versus 2 guardians throwing down and playing? And we were like, we're going to do it. And so that's Battle for Boar. That, it's just it's insanity. Because it's like, just take whatever matrices you were dealing with and then just explode them.
Right.
I think... Yeah. I think it's interesting. You get to weird choices. You get to interesting choices. Battle for Boar is like sort of like big, bolsterous, like sort of like, but crazy, right? Like, because there's so many dynamics at play. Like,
and just to be clear, Battle for Boar is 3 or 4 players on the same 3x3 grid, double the amount of people, double the amount of stuff, double the amount of rules, win conditions, and all that stuff, and it's crazy town, and it's a really good time.
Yeah, but but part of that was like, where where do we go with this crazy town, and how orderly do we want crazy to be, or how like crazy do we want it to be, right? And it's definitely. It's definitely Smash Bros, right? Like it's got that. But so the thing I wanted to end on, because we're at an hour, it's always fun talking with you, of course. So when you look back on again, we're still in the process. We're still finalizing all these, tuning as we playtest. We'll continue as we're refining and finalizing all the files and things like that. When you look back on the process, Are there any pieces of advice or takeaways for folks? Like, so let's go back to the original premise here. I have, maybe it's not asymmetric game, but I have a game, a tactics type game, or a game that I'm doing expansion to. And from a design perspective, what are some things like you would boil down to keep in mind? Like the key things you should think about when you're expanding on an existing.
Right. I mean, I think one, we talked about previously, like figuring out, make those lists. What are the constants of this game, and where are the opportunities for change? And I think, sometimes you run into expansions and stuff that are just like more of the same stuff, just more variety. But I think to build an expansion that's exciting, you got to have some twists. You got to bring something new to the table. So whether that's that new mechanic that makes you play the game a little bit differently as a result, it gives you new additional options that kind of deepen the player agency space or whatever. I think figuring out what you don't want to change is important, because you don't want to change everything. You might as well make a brand new game. So you have to figure out like where you can fit in these twists. Things. You set up your goals ahead of time. You're like, we want this to be, play the same length of time. We want the player count to be the same. We want these. We want to maintain all our terms. We know what a layer space is. We know what, we know where our units can spawn. So let's keep that the same, and just carve out the areas that you can do some interesting things. And honestly, there's something. I mean, besides the fact on this particular game, the testing matrix was so complicated. There's something nice about building on solid ground, right? Whereas when you're starting a brand new design, anything can change. With an expansion, there's a lot of stuff that can't change. And that's like a really interesting puzzle from a designer's perspective of like, how do I build this interesting thing with so much of it is locked down already? And like, I think that's from a design perspective, like expansions are fun that way, in which like it isn't a blank canvas. So some people say to an artist, a blank canvas is like their worst nightmare because it's like they can do anything, versus like, oh, well, I need these 3 requirements of the piece you're working on. It's like, oh, I can, like, those confines helps you be more creative. And I think, that's true for board game expansions too, like building on that solid foundation and having the challenge of building something compelling.
Awesome. Well, I think we should end on that. For those who have been here for this time, thank you for enjoying it with us. Really excited. I'll have the Kickstarter preview page link in the description. Certainly, if you dug Skulk Hollow, do check it out, or Asymmetric, or any of the things we described. But just it's been really, every time I play, I'm still like, oh, this is this cool dynamic, or I enjoy that. I mean, like that's why we clearly we like this game.
Right.
But like, but it's been cool to go through the process, and it has been quite a learning process. And I think it'll be interesting to see how we apply some of that, going into the next thing, right? So, anyway, thanks so much, Keith.
Yeah, man. Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Hey everybody, Edo here, and thanks for watching Gaming with Edo. Reviews over here on this playlist, League and Insider videos over here on this one. Subscribe, share, all that good stuff. But most importantly, play some great games. Thanks.